She asked me that question on the coldest night of November, standing in the doorway between the barn and the frozen prairie, with nothing but a thin shawl pulled around her shoulders and the wind tearing at her hair. "Is there room in your bed?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and I could see her breath rising in small clouds between us, like prayers sent up too late for any church. I didn't answer right away. I stood there holding the lantern, staring at her face. Those pale green eyes that had been watching me for 3 weeks with something I hadn't dared to name. And I felt everything I'd ever believed about honor and restraint crumbling inside me like old timber rotting under the weight of a long winter. Then I said it. I said the only thing a man like me had no business saying to a married woman in 1883, by standing in a borrowed barn on land that wasn't mine, with nothing to my name but a broke-down horse and a guilty conscience. "Will you stay with me forever?" I said. And the way she looked at me when I said it, Lord, that look. I knew that was the moment my whole life split in two. There was the life I'd been living before, and there was everything that came after Clara Merritt walked across that cold ground and stepped into the light I was holding. I reckon I should start 3 weeks back, because a story like this one don't make sense if you come at it from the middle. A man deserves to understand how a drifter with nothing to offer could end up being the answer to a woman's prayers, or her ruin, depending on how you choose to look at it. My name is Wade Calloway. I was 38 years old that autumn. I'm tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair gone a little long from too many miles between barbers, and eyes the color of a sky trying to decide between gray and blue. I'd been riding through the territories for the better part of 6 years at that point. Since the ranch my father built in Texas burned down to nothing and took my brother with it. I wasn't a bad man. I wasn't an outlaw. I was just a man with nowhere particular to be, and no one waiting on him, drifting from one stretch of prairie to the next, like a leaf that never quite found the water. I'd done farmhand work in Kansas, wrangled cattle in the Dakotas, fixed fences for a widow up near the Wyoming line. I was a working man without a home, and I'd made a kind of peace with that, or so I told myself. The storm that put me on the Merritt property came out of the northwest on a Saturday, fast and mean and full of ice. My horse, a sorrel mare I called Dust, threw a shoe crossing a rocky creek bed and came up lame about 5 miles from any shelter I could see. I was leading her on foot through the sleet when I spotted the lamp in the window of the ranch house, a pale orange glow about a 1/4 mile off the trail. I didn't have much choice. A man don't let pride kill his horse. I walked up to that door and knocked. If you're enjoying this story, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. We will leave a little heart on your comment. Now, back to Wade and Clara. The woman who opened the door was not what I expected. I don't rightly know what I expected. Some broad-faced farmer's wife with a baby on one hip and flour on her apron, I suppose. What I found instead was Clara Merritt. She was 34 years old, though she looked both younger and older than that, somehow, depending on the light and what was in her eyes. Her hair was the deep auburn color of maple leaves in October, pinned up in a loose knot at the back of her neck, with a few strands pulling free around her face. Her eyes were pale green, the shade of creek water in spring, and they were sharp and steady in a way that made you feel looked at rather than just seen. She was slender, but not frail. Frontier life had made her strong in the particular way that it does for women who have to be, and she wore a wool dress the color of winter sky with a white apron tied at her waist. She stood in that doorway and looked me over from hat to boot without a word, and then she stepped aside and said, "You better come in before you freeze to death." I stepped into that kitchen, and the warmth hit me like something solid. There was a fire in the stove, a pot of something good-smelling on the burner, and a lamp on the table, casting yellow light over everything. I pulled my hat off and told her my situation. Lame horse, the storm, no intention of causing trouble. And she listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was a rare thing in a person. "You can put your horse in the barn," she said. "There's a stall free. My husband is in town and won't be back until Monday. I can offer you the guest room and supper. But after Monday, you'll need to talk to Hank about wages if you want to stay on." I thanked her and meant it. I told her my name, and she told me hers. Clara. She said it plain, the way people say things they've had no particular reason to be precious about. And that was the beginning of it, though I didn't know it then. I thought it was just a storm and a lame horse, and the basic kindness of a decent woman. I had no idea I was walking into the hardest thing I'd ever face in my life, and I'd faced a fair number of hard things. Hank Merritt came back on Monday as promised, and I made my case to him for staying on. He was a large man, somewhere north of 45, with reddish hair gone gray at the temples and the look of a man who had once been powerful and now carried that weight poorly. His handshake was firm but distracted. He asked me what I could do: fencing, livestock, carpentry, and told me I could stay in the barn, use the guest room when the cold got bad, and he'd pay me a fair wage. He didn't smile and didn't offer his hand again. He went inside, and I heard a cabinet open and glass on wood, and Clara's voice, low and careful, saying something I couldn't make out. I got to work the next morning before sunup. The Merritt homestead was a good-sized operation. About 300 acres of mixed prairie and farmland, a solid house, a barn, a chicken coop, a smokehouse, and 2 fields that had been fallow too long. Hank had about 40 head of cattle, 6 horses, and more repair work waiting than one man could get through in a season. I didn't ask questions about why things had gotten behind. I just started in on the list. It took me about 4 days to understand the shape of the household. Hank worked when he was sober, which was mornings and early afternoons, and he was capable enough when he put his mind to something. But by mid-afternoon, most days he was pulling from a bottle he kept in the tack room, and by supper time he was either sullen or loud, depending on what kind of drunk it was going to be. He wasn't violent, at least not that I saw in those first weeks. He was the other kind of mean, the slow, grinding kind that wears a person down through cold words and heavy silences, and the particular cruelty of making someone feel invisible in their own home. Clara moved through all of it with a steadiness that I found both remarkable and painful to witness. She cooked 3 meals a day, kept the house, tended the chickens, managed the kitchen garden even in the cold, and took on whatever else needed doing without complaint. She was efficient and quiet, and she had a way of making herself small in Hank's presence that I recognized as a kind of practiced survival. But when Hank was out in the fields or down at the bottom of a bottle in his chair, something in her opened up. She would sing low to herself while she worked. She'd stop at the kitchen window and stare out at the sky with a look that wasn't sadness exactly, more like longing, like a woman remembering something she'd been told she wasn't allowed to want anymore. I started eating supper at the kitchen table most evenings, which Clara offered, and I accepted because the barn got cold and lonely after dark. Hank rarely joined us. He took his plate to his chair by the fire or didn't eat at all. Clara and I sat across from each other at that long pine table and talked the way people do when they've been starved of honest conversation, carefully at first, and then more freely as the days went on. She was from Missouri originally, and she'd come west with Hank when she was 20, full of the particular hope that young women carry when they believe in a man's vision. She didn't say what had happened to that hope. A man can see the distance between where a person started and where they landed. I told her about Texas and my brother. First time I'd spoken of any of it in years. She listened with her whole attention, those green eyes steady on my face, not filling the silences with noise the way most people do. When I finished, she said, "I'm sorry about your brother." Just that. But she meant it. And I had to look down at my coffee cup because I wasn't prepared for someone to say it like they meant it. That was the end of the second week. By then, I'd already started doing the thing I knew I shouldn't be doing, which was noticing everything about her. The way her hands moved when she was thinking. The sound of her laugh when something genuine caught her off guard. Rare and low, and a little surprised, like she'd forgotten she was allowed to do it. I kept telling myself I was just lonely, and she was just kind, and that there wasn't anything in it. Men lie to themselves with great skill when the truth is inconvenient. The thing that broke through my lying happened on a Wednesday evening in the third week. Coming in from the north pasture, I passed the kitchen window and glanced up. Hank was standing over Clara at the kitchen table, and one hand flat on the wood beside her, his face close to hers, saying something in a low, hard voice. Clara sat with her shoulders pulled in and her jaw set, not looking at him, waiting for it to be over. The way a person waits out a storm they can't stop. I stood in the cold with my hands tight around my fence tools until I trusted myself to walk away. I put away my tools. I sat on the hay bale for a long time, telling myself it wasn't my business, and I was just a hired hand, and I needed to remember what I was. But knowing what you are, don't always hold against what you feel. I reckon that's been true since the first man and woman stood on the first piece of this earth together and made things complicated. The following Sunday, Hank rode to town saying he'd be back by nightfall. Nurse and Clara and I spent the day working on opposite sides of the homestead. Around noon, she brought me a tin plate of biscuits and coffee, and we stood in the pale winter sun for a while, easy in each other's company, in the way that only happens when two people have gotten past the need to perform anything for each other. That afternoon, she walked out past the property to where a creek ran shallow and mostly frozen through a stand of cottonwood trees. I followed at a distance, not examining why. I found her standing at the edge of the ice with her hands folded in front of her, looking out at the flat white land stretching south toward nothing you could name. The cottonwoods were bare and gray against the sky. "Do you ever feel like you could just ride until the land runs out?" she said. "Every day," I said. I used to dream about it," she said. "I thought coming west would be like that. Like riding into something huge and open." She was quiet for a moment. "Turns out you can be in the biggest country in the world and still feel very small inside of it." I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say. After a moment, her shoulder leaned against mine, so lightly, so briefly, that I almost believed I'd imagined it. Almost. And I understood that I was in serious trouble, the deep and irreversible kind, and there wasn't a thing I was going to do about it except try to be a decent man for as long as I could manage it. That lasted about a week. The night she came to the barn, Hank had been gone since Thursday. He'd ridden to Milford, the closest thing to a town within 30 miles, for supplies and, Clara said without looking at me when she said it, probably to see about a card game. She expected him Friday evening. He hadn't come. Saturday passed and Sunday morning rose gray and bitter cold, and by Sunday evening the temperature had dropped below anything I'd felt that season, and the wind was building in the northwest again. I'd banked the barn stove hot and gotten the animals settled, and was lying in the bunk I'd set up in the back corner with my coat over the blankets, reading by lantern light. One of the 3 books I carried with me everywhere, a battered copy of a collection of American poems that had been my mother's. I heard the barn door open. I sat up. She was standing just inside the door, and the wind had shoved in behind her and scattered straw across the floor before she got it shut again. Now she was wearing her heavy wool dress and the dark gray shawl she favored in the cold, and her hair was down. I hadn't seen it down before, and it was longer than I'd guessed, falling past her shoulders in waves that the wind had made wild. Her feet were in boots, but no stockings underneath, which told me she'd come quickly, without planning it all the way through. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her eyes were very bright in the lamplight, and she was holding the shawl together at her chest with one hand, like she needed something to hold on to. We looked at each other for what felt like a long time. The wind pressed at the walls of the barn, and the stove ticked, and one of the horses shifted in her stall. I set the book down on the blanket beside me and waited. "Is there room in your bed?" she said. My heart hit the inside of my chest like a fist. I looked at her, all of her, the wind-wild hair and the unlaced boots and the bright, frightened, brave eyes. And I felt the last wall I'd been building between what I wanted and what I was allowed to want come down all at once. It didn't fall slow. It came down the way things do when they've been under pressure long enough, and something finally gives. All at once, with everything in it. I stood up from the bunk. I crossed the space between us. I stopped close enough that I could have touched her if I'd let myself, and I looked down into her face and I said, "Will you stay with me forever?" She drew in a breath, sharp and small. Her eyes went wide, and then something in them shifted, opened up, like a window being unlatched after a long winter. A tear ran from the corner of one eye before she could stop it. She reached up and pressed her fingers against her own mouth for a moment, like she was trying to hold back something that was going to come out one way or another. Then she dropped her hand and said very quietly, "Nobody has ever asked me that." I said, "I'm asking you now. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now, and drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. We leave a heart on every single one." Now let's see what Clara answers. She sat down on the edge of the bunk, and I sat beside her, and we talked until the stove burned low and the wind quieted outside, and the barn settled into the deep, particular silence of a cold night when the snow is finally done blowing. She told me things she hadn't told anyone, about the first years with Hank, then when the dream still felt like it might come true, the land they'd claimed, the house they'd built, the plans they'd had for cattle and crops, and a family of their own. About the winter their first child didn't survive. About how Hank had turned after that, slowly at first and then faster. Like something in him had given up the fight against whatever darkness was pulling at him. About the years of watching him shrink into the bottle and watching herself shrink into silence. About the loneliness. She used that word, loneliness, and she said it the way people say a word they've lived inside for so long it's gotten into the walls of them. I listened to all of it. I didn't try to fix it or explain it or rush past the hard parts. I just sat beside her and let her say what she needed to say. Because I had a feeling that one of the things she needed, maybe more than anything else, was just to be heard by someone who actually wanted to know. When she finished, she looked at her hands in her lap for a while. Then she looked up at me and said, "What you asked me? Did you mean it?" "Clara," I said, "I have been in love with you since the second week of October, and I have been trying my damnedest to be a good man about it. I meant every word." She looked at me for a long moment with those clear green eyes, and I watched her think it through. Watched her weigh everything, the life she'd built here, and the life she'd given up building. What it would mean to go and what it would mean to stay. What kind of woman she was willing to be, and what kind she could no longer stand to be. That's the thing people don't understand about moments like that one. They think it's simple. They think it's all feeling and no thought. But a woman like Clara, a woman who had survived as long as she had by being careful and clear-eyed, she thought it through. All of it. Even sitting there in the lantern light in a cold barn at some hour of a Sunday night, with the wind finally gone quiet. I respected her for it. I would have thought less of her if she hadn't. Then she took my hand, both her hands around mine, her fingers cold and strong. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just held my hand and looked at it like she was learning it, memorizing it, making sure it was real. "There's not much to take," she said finally. "Some clothes, my mother's Bible, a little money I've kept aside." I said, I don't need you to bring anything." "I know," she said, "but I want to bring those things." I said I'd have the horses ready by first light. She nodded. She was still holding my hand. Outside, the temperature had dropped to something severe, and the sky had come clear after the storm. And through the one small window in the barn wall, I could see stars, thousands of them. The kind of sky you only get in the open country, far from everything. The kind of sky that makes a man feel the size of what's possible when he stops letting fear make his decisions for him. We sat together in the quiet, side by side on that bunk, until the cold made it necessary to put more wood in the stove. And then we sat together some more, and I told her about the territories I'd ridden through. Colorado, New Mexico, the high country up near the Montana border, where the mountains feel like walls made of something better than stone. I told her there was good land still available in Colorado and honest work, and that I knew people in 3 towns who would help us get settled. I told her I was not a rich man and never would be, but I was a hard worker, and I would give her what I had and everything I ever made. I told her I would be faithful and kind, and that I would never make her feel small or invisible in her own life. She listened with her head leaning against my shoulder, which is where it had ended up somewhere in the first hour. And when I was finished, she said, "I haven't let myself want anything in so long. I forgot what it felt like." A pause. "It feels terrifying." "Yeah," I said. "I reckon it does." "And right," she said quietly. It feels right." I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. I put my arm around her, and she settled in against me, and we watched the stove and the light and the shadows moving on the old barn walls. And somewhere between the 4th and 5th hour of that night, I realized that I had stopped drifting. Not just that night, not just in that barn, but inside myself. In the deep part of a man where the wandering actually lives, I had stopped moving. I had arrived somewhere. I don't know if that makes sense to anyone who hasn't been through it. But if you've been the kind of person who can't stay, who keeps moving because moving keeps you from having to feel how empty the standing still is, then maybe you understand what I mean when I say that the thing I felt sitting in that barn with Clara Merritt's head on my shoulder was the strangest and most profound relief I had ever known. We didn't sleep. The night was too much for sleeping. We talked and were quiet, and talked again, and when the darkness started going gray outside the window, we both understood, without saying it, that the hour was here. She stood up and straightened her dress and pulled the shawl back around her shoulders, and we looked at each other in the growing light. "I'll be ready before Hank gets back," she said. "I'll have everything set," I said. She walked to the barn door and pulled it open. Shucks, and the blue-gray light of the early prairie morning came in around her. cold and clean and endless, the sky above the flat land beginning to change at the east edge from black to something close to rose. She stood in that light for a moment and looked back at me over her shoulder, and she was so beautiful it was like a punishment and a gift at the same time, and I understood fully what it meant to want something you'd do anything to keep. She walked back to the house. I started getting the horses ready. By the time the sun was fully up, we were 2 figures on horseback moving south across the prairie, the homestead growing smaller behind us, and the sky opening up enormous ahead. Clara had her mother's Bible in the saddlebag, and her hair loose under her hat, and her back straight in the saddle, I riding like a woman who had remembered something important. I rode beside her and let the land do what it does in the early morning out on the plains, make everything feel simultaneously very large and very simple. After a while, she looked over at me. "Where are we going?" she said. "Colorado," I said, "if that suits you." She thought about it for all of 2 seconds. "It suits me fine," she said. We rode. The prairie stretched south into a pale winter haze, and the horses were glad to be moving. I thought about Hank coming back to an empty house, and felt bad about it the way you feel bad about something necessary that causes pain. He wasn't an evil man. He was a broken one, and the 2 of them had been wearing each other down for years in a way that hadn't been good for either of them. I didn't feel righteous. I just felt the truth of it. Clara didn't look back. That told me everything. The first town we came to was a small way station called Dunbar's Creek, barely more than a general store and a livery. We stopped to rest the horses and get coffee. The woman behind the counter poured our cups and cut us each a slice of dried apple pie and wished us a good ride south. Small kindnesses. The world is full of them when you're finally moving in the right direction. That night, we camped in a hollow out of the wind. A good fire going, the horses tied close. Clara made coffee and we ate from the provisions she'd brought, talking the way you talk when the hardest decision has already been made, and the life ahead feels more real than the one behind. She talked about what she wanted: a kitchen with good light, a garden she chose herself, a dog, small, ordinary things she'd never had the heart to ask for. I listened and felt the ache of a man finally given the chance to give someone something and meaning to follow through. We made Colorado in 8 days. I still know every one of them. Looking back on it now, and I've had years to look back on it, sitting on the porch of the house we built outside of Durango with the mountains at our back and the valley going gold in the afternoon. I think about that night in the barn most often. Not the wedding in the little church in Ouray on a Thursday in January. Not the first morning I woke up beside her in a room that was ours. I think about the lantern and the cold, and the wind going quiet, and her voice saying those 6 words. "Will you stay with me forever?" I said. And she did. And I did. And whatever else the frontier took from both of us over the years, it never took that. The answer never changed. A man can drift a long way before he finds the thing that stops him. A woman can wait a long time before she finds someone who asks the right question. When those 2 things happen at the same time, in the same cold November barn, under the same frozen sky. That's just about as close to a miracle as a person like me has any right to expect. And I'll take it. If this story touched you, subscribe to our channel right now and leave a comment with your city. We read every single one and leave a heart to say thank you. Until next time, from somewhere out on the prairie, much obliged.